Chris Busby is the director of the Low-Level Radiation Campaign. He's out of the UK. Dr. Chris Busby says, in any case, it's a human rights issue. People don't actually want to inhale uranium, strange as it may seem. The military says, oh, we need this weapon because it enables us to win wars. Well, fair enough, said Dr. Busby. Then you might as well use nerve gas or biological weapons. The same argument applies. I quite agree. When was DU first used? Well, talk about it was when it was first used on a wide scale. It was first used in the Gulf War in 1991, then later in Bosnia, Croatia, 94 to 95, and the Balkans, which is also known as the former Yugoslavia area, in 1999. At the time, they used missiles, rockets, bombs, and armament that contained depleted uranium. The Gulf War vets right now from 1991, roughly 800,000 of them almost, roughly 1/3 of them deployed then, now have what's known as Gulf War syndrome. We'll get into that more later, but it's believed to have its roots in uranium. There are unfathomably high amounts of civilians with Gulf War syndrome symptoms in these countries. What depleted uranium does, and other heavy metals as well, they cause damage to the cellular immune system. It has, according to Dr. Rosalie Bertell, has no positive biological use. Depleted uranium is a military term. When natural uranium is mined, it goes to be refined after it's mined. It's called milling. And they extract, it's called tri-uranium oxide, I can't say that fast, which is just a uranium oxide. It's a gas. They extract it from the ore to form yellow cake. Mining generates substantial quantity of mill tailings, which is basically like the waste of the uranium product. This accounts for 95% of the volume of all the radiological waste from all steps of nuclear weapons and power production. So with mining and milling, the chemical process from yellow cake into the next step, which is uranium hexafluoride gas, this is called uranium conversion. Then the uranium hexafluoride is enriched and it's chemically converted to either uranium oxide or metal. This is all boring and I don't even like it, but it's just good to know. In order for you to take natural uranium and turn it into munitions that they use in war, it's a very long process, it's very expensive, and it really harms environmental health and public health. And we'll talk a little bit more about the people who live near those sites. This uranium hexafluoride is chemically toxic and radioactive both. It reacts readily with moisture. It produces a highly toxic gas. It's hydrofluoric acid. Much illnesses and accidents among workers and people in communities around these plants are caused. The decay product that's in this waste they call uranium mill tailings has a half-life of 75,000 years, which means at the end of 75,000 years, half of it is still left over. So this is something we're leaving for generations, unforeseen numbers of years, 75,000, half of it is still left over. It causes a great and severe threat to native indigenous peoples of the U.S. Also in Canada, it's a huge problem as well as in any place, but Australia also is a concern. The native people have been bribed to store this on their reservations. Sometimes it's stored on the reservations and they don't even know it. There isn't the proper safeguards. Sometimes it leaches into the soil and it goes into the rivers. So this is really not good. The next thing that happens, and we'll get into more of this later, is right near many of the indigenous indigenous reservations where the Native Americans live is they do military testing, they explode it, they burn it, and so this is even worse of a hazard for these people. One of the tribal leaders in 1992, his name was Johnny Jackson, he said, "It's genocide aimed at Indian people who will suffer the consequences of poisoning our rivers and our land with nuclear waste." 1/3 the tailings, that's the uranium waste, impacts the Navajos. It gives the miners there lung cancers, and it also, it's unacceptable. I'm going to skip. I was going to tell you all about the nuclear process cycle, but I want to get into the meat of the interesting things. I want to talk a little bit about Gulf War vets. The U.S. Research Advisory Committee on Gulf War vets' illnesses, they ruled out psychological and psychiatric illnesses as the cause of the symptoms of those who are suffering from the Gulf War syndrome. They looked at the heavy metal and the radiological properties of these weapons and their combined effects on immune system, neurological, hormonal, reproductive systems of vets and civilians. A damaged immune system makes people more vulnerable to viruses, bacteria, electromagnetic, radiological hazards, toxic metal explosives. It also affects the hormone system, which regulates the homeostasis. And when the cell is at rest, it needs to be at rest. But what radiation does is it does not allow that cell to rest. It continually fires, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Also, the impact they found is on the heavy metals, the clearance. The kidney cannot take too much of the heavy metals, and it can't filter it out. Just to let you know, when you think of radiation, I never knew what it was, but now I think of it as a form of energy. 1 microgram of pure uranium-238 undergoes 12.4 atomic transformations, which are submicroscopic explosions every second. So again, that's just 1 microgram of this U-238 undergoes 12.4 atomic explosions, might as well say. And each explosion gives off 4.15 to 4.2 million electrovolts in random directions, but it only requires 6 to 10 electron volts to break the DNA strand in a cell. So in one day, 1 microgram of pure uranium-238 would release 1,071,000 alpha particles, each one with more than 4 million electron volts of energy into the organic tissue. The point here is that even a tiny bit of radiation can do a great deal of harm. Each of the range of just 1 alpha particle can go about 6 cells. And the radioactivity emitted by the mixture of the uranium and its decay products is even greater. I want to show you a picture, and it's an alpha ray exploding. And I will pass around these things in a couple of minutes so that you can see the actual picture. But it bombards the cell and 6 cells nearby. The radioactivity emitted by this can cause, and this is a quote by Dr. Bertel, damage can occur to the cell wall, the cytoplasm, which is the fluid that fills up much of the volume of the cells, and the nucleus. It is most serious, however, when the DNA or the genetic coding in the nucleus is harmed. Dr. Carl Z. Morgan has linked the disorganization, has likened it to a madman loose in a library. He said that when radiation hits the cell structure, consider it like a madman loose in a library who was tearing out pages of the volumes. And these are irreplaceable volumes. That's what our cells are. You can't replace that exact cell. It gets damaged. once the DNA is damaged, its distorted messages can be transmitted to the cell, and it passed on in their replication, or she actually uses the word reproduction. I call it replication. I wanted to show you tell you about one other quote, and it is about the ability of what ionizing radiation does. And ionizing radiation, I never really understood it, but the easiest way to explain it is it's radiation that has enough energy so that during an interaction with an atom, it can detach or remove, or they call it ionize, at least one of the tightly bound electrons from the orbit of the atom, causing the atom to become changed or ionized. So the ability of this ionizing radiation to cause hereditary defects was shown by Mueller in 1927. So they knew about radiation and what it does back then. They've done studies that show that artificial sources of radiation mimic the genetic damage caused by naturally occurring radiological particles in the environment. Uranium is a natural particle. We'll breathe in 1 to 3 parts per million. Just because it's underground, our body can take it, can take that tiny little bit and filter it out without, many harmful effects. But all the man-made radiation that we put in the atmosphere since the 1940s only, as some of you may already know with the atomic production and testing, so that, what they have decided, what Mueller decided is, with his research, is that he did the experiments on these little tiny flies, and he found out that 99% of the mutations that a cell undergoes when it is bombarded with radiation, they're harmful, 99%. So all types of radiations which can be induced by chemicals can also be induced, and more efficiently, by radiation. So many genetic changes are recessive, and this is the part that always makes me really upset. It will not become visible in the population at all times until the 3rd or the 4th generation of offspring, which means that if they, did an atomic test in 1960, well, maybe, which is, like I was a girl, so maybe it wouldn't hit my child or my grandchild, but it could hit that future generations and so on. It can skip generations. So I'm just always thinking, what have we done to the future? So there's no such thing as radiation exposure so low that it can do no damage. Every single bit of radiation that pelts us has a 99% probability of harm. So the next question is, what damage is really important? What do we care about? The damage which is most apt to cause the most trouble in the whole system, like a human being, is the damage that hits the nucleus of the cell. Because inside the nucleus is the chromosome material, and it carries the template of what that cell does. So if you change that, you change what the cell produces, and if you change the cell, and it's still able to produce, it makes true cells with damaged chromosomes, which can cause exponential growth of the cells that are not going to do the right thing. And when I learned all of this about radiation, and I should tell you a tiny bit about me, I have a Bachelor of Science, which means only that I took as many courses as I needed to in college to graduate with Bachelor of Science. So it does not take a scientist to know this. I learned most of this, I think it was by 9th or 10th grade, Introduction to Physical Science. Maybe it was in chemistry in high school. What I'm saying is, this information is on the internet. That's how I found this out. It's available to anyone. And we all think, or at least I shouldn't say we all, but I thought, well, the atomic, the bombs that they were testing in Nevada and New Mexico, that's over many years ago. I don't have anything to worry about. Well, 2 things. Yeah, the radiation is still in the environment because some of those isotopes, they last for thousands. They can last even for billions of years, and we'll talk about that later. But so it still is a concern. Plus, they're still doing it. and I'll talk about that later, and that is actually why I'm here. Not because of what they did in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, but because they're still doing it. I recently I had the honor of meeting an eminent scientist from the Radiation and Public Health Project. Her name is Dr. Jeanette Sherman. She's one of the scientists who wrote this wonderful book. What the pink organizations don't tell us about breast cancer is that it's often caused by not just our lifestyle or the fact that our mom had breast cancer. It's often caused by things in the environment such as chemical toxins and also radiological materials. So this is what Dr. Jeanette Sherman said. I'm taking it right out of her book. When DU burns, it releases fine particles of radioactive material, much of it as small as nanoparticles, which when inhaled, they go deep into the lungs, and from there are transported to the liver, kidneys, bone marrow, brain, skeleton, seminal fluid, and other parts of the body. DU that is swallowed from airborne particles is transferred to the body, including the liver and kidneys. There are, if you've ever heard of radiation at all, you know, and we won't go in, it's very long, we could spend actually courses, right, on teaching radiation. And I'm not going to do that because, like I said, I'm not a scientist, but I can tell you, radiation decays. What it means is it turns into other materials. And some of them are around for a really long time, but some of what they call the daughter products are only around for a very short amount of time. I'll also pass this around in a moment. Uranium-238 is what is the majority of what's found in nature. It's also the majority of what's found in our weapons. It decays, although this doesn't show all of the decay, the entire decay cycle, it shows the main parts, but it's 22 stages. And I got this from a writer who's a uranium weapons expert. He told me there are 22 steps in the uranium decay chain. The entry chamber at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory has all the steps of the uranium decay chain emblazoned on one wall. The next to the last step is polonium-210. Now I'm going to get away from that quote for a second. Polonium-210, if you may remember, is what that Russian spy was given, that lethal dose of radiation, and he died within 3 weeks. I think his name was something like Litvinenko. I don't want to butcher his name, but it was polonium-210. I cannot tell you my shock and horror when I found out that uranium-238, which, as I said, is found in nature, also found in our weapons, decays to polonium-210. So that is why I wrote this writer, I don't know if I just said his name, but his name is Bob Nichols. And I said, am I reading this chart? I sent him the link. Am I reading this right? This is the highly deadly stuff. This is part of the decay chain. So Bob said the next to the last step is polonium-210. It is treasured by nuclear weapons engineers because it is fissile, which means it creates a nuclear explosion. And it's employed in the nuclear weapons triggers manufactured at the laboratory. There are atoms of polonium-210 in every pound of uranium that exists. And I'm going to go off this quote for a second, which means that it is in the environment, and when it was only a teeny tiny little bit, our body was still able to filter it. But now that it's man-made in our environment, huge quantities are exploded, it is now a health threat to humankind. Bob's quote continues, the wait is a long one, though, as you know. Half the uranium turns to lead in 4.5 billion years. Almost all the radioactive atoms are gone in a majestic 45 billion years. He said, by comparison, the Earth is estimated to be about 4 to 5 billion years old. So weapons building continues to produce polonium-210, much like the phosphates are always found with uranium ore. And this part is also very disturbing, this next sentence. In fact, uranium ore is rich in phosphates and it's used for fertilizer. But polonium-210, for some reason, has an affinity for the underside of tobacco leaves. This is what Dr. C. Everett Koop, U.S. Surgeon General, was talking about when he said tobacco is radiological and most lung cancer is caused by radiation. So the radioactivity adheres, it has this affinity for tobacco leaves. And so when people are smoking, they think it's just tobacco, and it's not. It's radiation in it. Uranium-238, found in nature, it decays into alpha particles, beta particles, and gamma rays. Rarely it undergoes spontaneous fission, but they don't use it in nuclear weapons as the primary desirable material because it doesn't easily generate the nuclear reaction. There is something very interesting that I never knew, but I recently learned when I studied pictures of bombs, like you've heard of atomic bombs and hydrogen bombs. Little Man, Fat Boy and Little Man, I think I said it wrong. The Hiroshima and the Nagasaki bombs. In the middle, they use what's called a tamper. And I knew that a tamper was to help it create a bigger nuclear blast. It also is used to create more heat and more radiation. They put this uranium-238 into these bombs, and we're going to go into, well, why would you do that? So, actually we'll go into it now. The reason why they do it is, part is to ignite a bigger explosion, but also it produces uranium gas. And I got another quote. I won't even say it, but it's because it's lots of expletives. But let's just say the blank bombs were 5 feet thick. They were as wide as would fit through the bomb bay doors. The bombs were poison gas dispersion devices. The nukes still are to this day. So I'm going to stop all. I have so much chemical and actually it probably isn't even necessary to go into this to the degree that I was going to. I'll talk more about the body and the little particles and what they do. DU is a dysfunction that it causes in the cellular repair and the DNA of the mitochondria of the cell. It also interacts with other toxic metals and other nanoparticles. And since this debris can theoretically remain in the air forever, it can also be resuspended, meaning that if you shoot a weapon that has depleted uranium and it falls eventually to the ground, well, if there's wind, like sand, if you think of like Afghanistan and Iraq, it gets resuspended, it can go back up in the atmosphere. They're so tiny, these little particles, that it actually can stay in the clouds and be released through rain or snow. So with the precipitation, it comes down again to the earth, and it can virtually keep on going, so that when we say we fire a uranium weapon, it isn't just gone. It stays in the environment for billions of years. I want to show an article. I want to talk a little bit about, well, first of all, I have some things to pass around. I'm going to pass those around. They are, oh, I got this thing on. Actually, maybe, you know what, maybe I should. Maybe I'll just put them here and you can take them as you like. Actually, before we get to the veterans, I'd like to just say that the effects of depleted uranium, and this is from Loren Ray and from Marion Falk, who was a scientist at the Livermore Lab. Actually, they both were, but Marion Falk worked on the Manhattan Project, the atom bomb. He's a physical chemist, and she's a geologist with a great experience in radiation as well. But depleted uranium has 3 types of effects. One is chemical, which means that the changes in a substance are due to an alteration of its chemical composition causing changes to its atom or molecules, radiological. It changes when the nucleus of an isotope undergoes disintegration and releases energy in the form of alpha or beta particles and or gamma rays. About 30% of the radiation damage to cells is caused by the bullet effect. What I was talking about before is that it acts like a bullet around to the various cells, but the alpha and the beta particles tear through the cells. And about 70% of the damage is caused by changes in the cells and the biological molecules from the energy. But the third thing that isn't often talked about, that to their credit, Lorraine Murray and Marion Folk brought to mind, is this new thing, well, it's relatively new, nanoparticles. When they realized that these particles are so tiny, it's submicroscopic even, these create their own disease just by virtue of the fact that they're nanoparticles. So no matter what they've done is with studies that no matter what the particle, if you give a regular sized particle to an animal, its body can handle it. But when you give it nanoparticles, it's so tiny that it can just go through the cells and it creates horrible damage for that organism. What I'd like to talk about is the veterans. And I thought there was a veteran that came to me yesterday, and he had said to me that he was having some symptoms. And it was the first time a veteran had ever said that to me. And my heart stopped, and I asked him what his symptoms were. He said, well, I have horrible headaches, and I've got pains in my body where I didn't have any injuries. And he says, I've got really severe depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. And I know that veterans have post-traumatic stress disorder in any war, and also depression, but the pains and the fact that he's got a horrible headache leads one to believe that maybe they would like to get a test for this. And he won't go to the VA for the testing because he says it's a mess. So we have a problem because we've got a lot of sick vets who, for various reasons, aren't getting the treatment and the care that they need. The other thing about the veterans is that what they're doing is they're trying to, as much as they can, to not diagnose our veterans with uranium poisoning. If you do that, it's a huge expense to the Veterans Affairs Office. And we'll go into some more statistics later about veterans, but it's just a very serious problem. The United States and NATO continue to state that there are known adverse health effects in the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs Depleted Uranium Medical Project, and there have been tests, but they don't always even use the proper methodology. They don't always properly test the isotopes, and I'm going to read exactly. This is from the Uranium Medical Research Center because it's hard to paraphrase this. DU is always mixed with a natural uranium background, so that you have to measure the DU in the presence of natural uranium. That requires an isotopic analysis of uranium-235, uranium-238 at least, and preferably also of uranium-236, which does not exist in natural uranium, but it's actually manufactured in the nuclear reactors. So the uranium-238 versus 235 ratio of 137.9 indicates natural uranium, but ratios above 140 provide unequivocal evidence of the presence of depleted uranium. It is essential to determine whether the uranium is depleted, enriched, or natural uranium in order to determine how long it's been in the body. If DU or enriched uranium is found in the body, we can postulate that it has been internally irradiating the victims since their exposure. The Iraq veterans from 1991 to 1995, 82% of them handled depleted uranium or they entered Iraqi vehicles that were contaminated with depleted uranium. They did a study, and they found, this is the government, they found, and this was done by the U.S. Battelle Pacific Northwest Laboratory. They found that the chemical toxicity is the critical limit for soluble uranium compounds, and the critical organ is the kidney, and soluble compounds present a radiological hazard. So they do know. It presents a hazard to the lungs. 6 months before the Gulf War, a Science Application International Corporation report, which the government hired to do this report, they said short-term effects of high doses can result in death, while long-term effects of low doses have been implicated in cancer. And shortly after the Gulf War in March 1991, a memo from the U.S. Nuclear Defense Agency stated that alpha particles emitted from DU dust created from exploding DU ammunition poses a health risk, but beta particles from DU shrapnel and from intact DU bullets are also a serious hazard to health. I could go on and on. The point is, they know. Now, they are always saying it's not a problem, it's not a problem. Here's a quote by someone in the Department of Defense, Dr. Michael Kirkpatrick. He says, the U.S. military has yet to discover a case of an American service member becoming ill due to its use of DU over the past few decades. There's great, I won't even tell you how much information there is to the contrary. There was an article done, and this is by that same writer, Bob Nichols, and it was called Heads Roll at the Veterans Administration, Mushrooming Depleted Uranium Scandal Blamed. What it is that a gentleman, he actually left the military because of this huge scandal of depleted uranium, and that so many victims were sick. So his name was, let's see, Mr. Principe. The VA Secretary's Principe was aware of this fact about the dead and dying veterans back as far as 2000. He and the current administration have been hiding these facts. So, what are the symptoms of depleted uranium poisoning?
Could you just give me a second?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Symptoms of depleted uranium poisoning, there's a lot. I'll read them fast. Infections, hair loss, loss of smell, lung damage, kidney damage, nerve damage, neurological problems, severe headaches, depression, muscle weakness, joint and muscle pain, sleep disturbance, skin rashes, shortness of breath, chronic fatigue syndrome, vision problems, cardiovascular signs, problems with the heart, thyroid disease, asthma, chemical insensitivities, cancers, autoimmune deficiencies and disorders, fevers and night sweats, fluid buildup, gastrointestinal symptoms, abnormal birth defects, sinus disease, and the Afghani citizens have exhibited intractable vomiting, severe respiratory problems, and internal bleeding. They've also been found, I read reports of bleeding from their nose and all just after some bombings. So how is this uranium gas distributed how is it dispersed? Well, there's different ways that they do it, but it can come from tanks, it can come from aircraft, it can come from bombs and missiles. And so there are a wide variety of weapon systems. And I've got some materials if anyone would like to see afterwards. But the bombs you hear about them, bunker busters, daisy cutters. They can range from small bombs, relatively small bombs, 500 pounds, 1,000 pounds, 2,000 pounds, but they've even used 15,000 pounds and 20,000 pounds rather. And they also fire them out of A-10 Warthog in what's called a Gatling gun that is this automatic distribution of the DU rounds. And let's see, I forget off the top of my head how fast. They're really, really fast. They so many per minute, and I'll find that in a moment. So we've been using, I don't even like to study weapons because it really does truly make me very sad, but I forced myself to try to read about these because they are the way that uranium are dispersed, and they are they're lethal munitions. What I wanted to say as well, and this is a little off the topic, but I found when going through the Air Force budget, I found that not only are they budgeting for bombs in 07, 08, 09, but they have quantities, huge quantities of white phosphorus. And that's also known as Willie Pete. It's a chemical agent. The U.S. says it's not illegal, but the rest of the world says yes, it's illegal, and it can burn the skin. So we're using white phosphorus as well. So this is something that is to me, it's very, very fascinating. It's like, what did the government know and when? I keep thinking, well, maybe they don't know, maybe they don't know. Here's something from October 30th of 1943. I won't read you the whole thing, but just part of it is that this is recommended by a report from some doctors, Conant, Compton, and Urey. They wrote this to Brigadier General Groves, and they said, it is recommended that a decision be obtained from competent authority authorizing additional work pertaining to the use of radioactive materials in order that this country may be ready to use such materials or be ready to defend itself against the use of such materials. And then it talks about the way that they would use this. Now remember, this is before they shot, they exploded the bombs. They said it would be used, and this is a quote, as a gas warfare instrument. The material would be ground into particles of microscopic size to form dust and smoke and distributed by a ground-fired projectile, land vehicles, or aerial bombs. In this form, it would be inhaled by personnel. The amount necessary to cause death to a person inhaling the material is extremely small. It has been estimated that 1/1,000,000th of a gram accumulating in a person's body would be fatal. There are no known methods of treatment for such a casualty. Two factors appear to increase the effectiveness of radioactive dust or smoke as a weapon. These are, 1, it cannot be detected by the senses, and 2, it can be distributed in a dust or smoke form so finely powdered that it will permeate a standard gas mask filter in quantities large enough to be extremely damaging. An offsetting factor in its effectiveness as a weapon is that in a dust or smoke form, the material is so finely pulverized that it takes on the characteristics of a quickly dissipating gas and is therefore subject to all the factors such as wind, working against maintenance of high concentrations for more than a few minutes over a given area. So they knew they were dispersing, if they used this weapon, they would be dispersing a radioactive poison gas. And they did, starting in the 40s, and they never stopped. So there is a fascinating document, and I put the link to it in your material. It was done by Lorraine Murray, and she presented it at the International Criminal Tribunal for Afghanistan. Basically, they asked her, what does the U.S. government know about DU? Well, she put pages of what the U.S. government knew and when they knew it. And it starts way back when. That was one of the things, that was 1943 about the Manhattan Project. But it goes on and on by different branches of the military saying that DU is no good and why we shouldn't use it. So I strongly encourage everyone to go to that. The link is on a website called whatreallyhappened.com/USKNOW, as in KNOW, DU.html. Again, that's whatreallyhappened.com/USKNOW, DU.html. What I'd like to talk about now is actually when did they use it, where did they use it. This is my, I don't mean to say favorite part, but this is the part that makes me do what I do. I did analysis myself. I've spent untold hours looking for any evidence of where have we in the U.S. used depleted uranium munitions. They were first used by Israel in this Yom Kippur War. After that, they were used by us, I recently found, in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. In '82, Israel used uranium weapons on South Lebanon. In '82 also, there was a Falklands conflict, and it was the United Kingdom and Argentina at battle. They wanted the islands that were the Falkland Islands, Georgia, and South Sandwich Islands. So supposedly uranium weapons were used then. And then in '89, the U.S. invasion of Panama. There was also use in South Korea and on an Okinawa, Japan base. It has since moved to South Korea. U.S. used uranium weapons on the Japanese Okinawa island, and they later admitted it, but they didn't even tell them they were going to do it. People from Japan were, up in arms because they had already, of course, been hit by our bombs in the 40s. So in 1991 Gulf War, there was a severe increase shortly after we got there, an increase in childhood cancers, leukemia, Hodgkin's disease, lymphoma, all kinds of congenital diseases, fetus were deformed, limbs were reduced, all kinds of abnormalities with genetics. Child leukemia has risen 600% in areas of rock where DU was heavily used, and stillbirths are often the case there. So are hitting them again with the 2003 shock and awe, and ever since has been really, really hard for Iraq. I counted 22 nations, and I'd like to list them. This is the best research I cannot guarantee, but this is at least what it looks like to me. It would be South Korea, Okinawa, Guam, Panama, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Laos, Kosovo, Serbia, Montenegro, Germany, Bosnia, Croatia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Puerto Rico, Vietnam, Somalia, Cambodia, South Korea, Pakistan, the Philippines, and the United States. When I got to 22, I said I hope I never have to count to 23 again. I have so many cards about all the wars, and I'm not going to tell you all about the wars. The wars in Kosovo. The former Yugoslavia was hit, but when we say they were hit, it wasn't just, as if that's not bad enough, it wasn't just Bosnia and Croatia, it wasn't just the former Yugoslavia, there's Montenegro, Serbia, and Kosovo. But it goes elsewhere. They found radiation, other nations, Greece, Hungary, Italy, it goes through the atmosphere. So what we have here is, it is a poison gas that travels. It doesn't just stop and say, well, okay, here's the border with Iraq, so I'll just stop here. It just goes. Long story short, there was research done February 2006, as I recall, by Dr. Chris Busby of a low-level radiation campaign in the UK, and he studied the filters. They have filters in the United Kingdom that detect radiation, and he had to go through a lot of rigmarole to get it. They didn't want to release, but he found that the information was that after the U.S. shock and awe bombing campaign, that was in March, April 2003, 9 days later, they found very high levels of radiation in the filters all the way in the United Kingdom. And you can learn all about the study. I won't tell you everything, but that is, so what happened in 7 to 9 days, uranium from the bombs in the shock and awe in Baghdad traveled 7 to 9 days. It traveled between 2,400 to 2,500 miles. So I read one of his interviews, and he says, And don't think, Americans don't think it didn't just stop here in Britain. It keeps going through wind. Wind doesn't just stop. If we look at the globe, we see it just keeps going. And that is why people, when the Chernobyl disaster occurred, people all over Europe felt the impact of it, and that, there was an increase in all kinds of radiation-induced diseases and health problems. So, Dr., and I always say, I want to say this name right, he's the head of globalresearch.ca, wonderful website, Dr. Michel Chossudovsky. He wrote that the primary victims of depleted uranium weapons, they're a war crime against children. Children are the ones who are most adversely affected by radiation because they're still growing. And mothers in utero who are in areas of high radiation have a serious risk of contaminating their child. What does the U.S. say? Well, in Afghanistan, Rumsfeld actually did say, January 16, 2002, this is talking about Afghanistan, one site registered an increased level of radioactivity, but it appeared to be a result of DU in some warheads and not from any nuclear or radiological weapons of mass destruction. It is downplayed. And what is very, very interesting is that it appears that there is no longer even the use of what we used to call depleted uranium. And I have to explain. I wrote an article called Kennedy, Cancer, and You, and it was about the fact that Ted Kennedy came up with, they discovered brain cancer this week in him. He lives, I figured on the map, about maybe close to maybe 10 miles, if that, maybe less, to the Massachusetts military reservation, where they actually did test firing of depleted uranium. They used that base for years there. And I wrote in my article that so many of the Kennedys, I started listing quite a few Kennedys that had cancer, or people who've been married to a Kennedy but lived in that area too. So what I discovered is that it's amazing that what we're doing is we're actually not nuking, not just pelting the uranium of the people overseas, but also here. And I wrote this article, and I wanted Americans to see the war isn't just over there. They're using it here at home through weapons, nuclear weapons explosions, that they pretend that they're going to explode a bomb. And what they use instead of, say, plutonium for that bomb is they use this uranium-238, the primary component of depleted uranium. And so they explode these in California, in Nevada, in New Mexico. So explode depleted uranium into the air. They also set it on fire. And the point I'd like to make with this is that we're calling it depleted uranium, what is being used, but according to this letter I got last night about my article, Di Williams is a weapons expert, probably one of the top in the world, and he wrote to me and he said, "It's great that you're on fire about depleted uranium, but you have to stop using that term." And he wrote a lengthy, long scientific letter explaining why. Long story short, the Uranium Medical Research Center, headed by Dr. Asaf Durakovic, found that in Afghanistan there was no signature of the isotopes where each if you do a sample of soil, the ratio of the isotopes of U-238, 235, and uranium-234, they've got to be in a specific ratio. Well, they found in Afghanistan that they're not. There were high levels of uranium in areas where there's little to any, very little natural uranium. And they said, what is this? People are getting sick from depleted uranium poisoning, but it looks like there's all this natural uranium, but that doesn't make sense because it's not found in nature here. So what they realized is, starting in the Afghan war and the current Iraq war, they're not using, quote unquote, the military term depleted uranium. When the military now says they're not using depleted uranium, it appears they're not. What we've been calling that for so many years, because it's a military term, it isn't depleted uranium. It is uranium that appears to be changed using the natural uranium. It's more pure form than the uranium that goes through all this processing. So this is going to be a very, very interesting development. Will the anti-depleted uranium movement pick up the ball, and that includes anyone like me who writes about this or speaks about it, to stop our terminology, stop calling it DU, and just start saying uranium weapons, period. Depleted uranium is a misnomer. They termed it that. They want us to think it's depleted, as in, oh, it's not. It's just weakly radioactive, mildly. It's not that. You know, what are these activists making a big deal of? I get attacked every time I write an article or a blog or whatever. But here's the deal. They want us to think it's depleted of uranium, of radioactivity. But this is what happens. Uranium-235, about half of it, which is only 0.5% of the entire bit of uranium. So they take out this little, not even 1%, but half of 1%, and they use it in nuclear weapons or nuclear power reactors. So what they're doing is basically saying, oh, you've taken out this is the stuff that we use for fissile, like I was talking about before, for the atomic explosions. So when they take that little tiny bit out, they're trying to tell us, oh, it's no longer radioactive. But actually, Dr. Bertel tells us it is. It's more radioactive, because what you're doing is, when you have uranium and you put it through the nuclear reactor, what happens is it also has little bits of what they call transuranics, and it's even more dangerous chemicals, such as plutonium, neptunium, and there's several others. Uranium-236 is another one that's manufactured. So, in other words, depleted uranium ain't. It's not depleted. I had planned to talk and on and on and on about bombs and things like that, like I said, but you know what? That's not critical. The important thing is that these tanks, jets, ships, they're delivering bombs, missiles, penetrators, bullets, and that is doing the deed. Uranium is pyrophoric. When it leaves any of these weapons dispersal systems, we often hear that it will penetrate that target, a tank, say, for example, and the Army's really, really good about saying, oh no, we don't need to use DU because no, we don't need it because there's no tanks. Well, that's not true. We've all heard of bunker busters that go through buildings. They will use this at the drop of a hat. It's what they like to use. It's incendiary. It goes into a big flame. It disperses the uranium gas. It even, when it's leaving the tube, as Doug Rocky says, when it's leaving, the friction, it's so pyrophoric that it just blasts it. It starts right away emitting the DU, going into, it just breaks apart. And that's how pyrophoric it is, that friction, the slightest tiny bit. Dr. Bertel even says even in air it can conceivably just get fired. I want to talk a little bit, let me just see if I've left out anything really, really important. I could go on. I have article after article about health links, about the Afghan people and the Iraqi people. They are suffering big time. And I used to think, when I first found out about this, I used to think, well, this is really very sad. It's terrible. I didn't even want to think about it. So how could how could my taxes be going to this? But there's really nothing I can do. Who am I? I'm just some family lady, and I'm nobody important. That's what I used to think. And then I realized, if every single person in the U.S. who found out about this started speaking, I don't care if it's to their neighbors, I don't care if it's writing little articles. I was never a writer, never in my life. I suddenly became a writer when I found out the truth of these things. And I've worked on it to try to get my writing better and better so that more people would read my things. I was never a speaker. I don't even like to speak. I am compelled by my conscience to do so. I cannot know all that I know and not tell everybody I can in every way that I can. So I try to think, how can I get out the truth? So yeah, we can do something, and that's getting into my activism. But first, what I want to do a little bit more is to tell you about a little bit more about the veterans. I'm real concerned about them right now because nobody seems to, in our government, really, they don't seem to care. Kissinger, called them dumb, stupid animals to be used as cannon fodder. That something to that effect was his quote. And I kind of wonder if that's maybe not the thinking. They know these guys are in harm's way. I'm very familiar with the work of Dr. Doug Rockey, and he tirelessly goes, as many engagements as we'll ask him, and he talks about the problem, and in a nutshell, and I've even talked to veterans myself to see is this true. They're not being told the dangers, they're not being shown the materials that Dr. Rockey himself put together for use. They're supposed to be showing all this material and given pamphlets and really supposed to know. If you ask me, they should be told everything before they ever enlist, but that's another subject for activists to think about. So our veterans, they don't want to diagnose them with these illnesses, and they're suffering horribly. And the sad thing is about this, when the veteran came up to me and he told me his issue yesterday, and he said, is there something that can cure me? Well, right now, no matter what you hear, there's nothing that, once you have radiation poisoning, there's no magic pill to make it go away. You're irradiated. And what you can do, though, the hope is for them, is that you can alleviate symptoms, and you also must keep your immune system, read everything that you can, because it attacks the immune system. So the things that you can do, like not smoke and walk and eat properly and take every kind of vitamin and mineral that helps the immune system, that is what they can do. What I was also distressed, and this is talking just off the cuff, I was distressed to find out that if I were to think that I'm a victim of radiation poisoning, I thought, well, I could go to my doctor, or I could find a lab, and I'll pay the money, even though I know it's $1,000. There are about 50 of these machines called mass spectrometry, and you can actually tell by evaluating someone's urine, you can tell if they have the certain isotopes of depleted uranium, or even just uranium that's way too high. So, but I found out that this is not something that we can do. A veteran can't just go up to one of these places and say, oh, here's my money I'd like to pay, which of course they shouldn't have to pay to begin with. They should all, if they have any suspicion, they should of course be tested and treated, but they're not. So that is something that we need to do. The Uranium Medical Research Center used to test vets. It would cost about $1,000, and it would depend on contributions, but those were for studies they were doing, and they're no longer doing studies on vets. They're studying contaminated areas such as Port Hope, Canada. That was the processing for our atom bomb in the 40s, but they've got the people of Port Hope, Ontario, very sick in that town, very, very sick in there. All you have to do is Google Port Hope contamination. You will learn everything about that. And that is, luckily, the Uranium Medical Research Center. They're the only ones in the United States doing it. As I said, Chris Busby of the Low-Level Radiation Campaign is doing it also in the United Kingdom. So we have a problem. We have, as I see it, a major problem. What I didn't even really get to, and I'm only going to go into briefly, I could speak for hours, and I won't. What I'd like to talk about is, what about here at home? We all know that the bombs were blasted. One of the top, who I consider top radiation experts, is a gentleman by the name of Russell Ace Hoffman. And Ace has calculated that they did even a little more than they said. Bombs in the U.S., 1,146 bombs on the U.S. soils. That includes the ones that were underground, but they often vent up, through cracks and all, so it wasn't like we didn't receive any of that. But so we are considered the most nuked nation in the world when you consider that as well. But they didn't stop using uranium in our atmosphere, and this is the point I think that if they're going to ever stop uranium weapons in the military, it first has to start here. And what I say is this, I'll just tell you a little bit about what's going on here. I was shocked. I was so sad about Iraq and Afghanistan, and then one day I read this article by Amy Worthington years ago, and it said, and depleted uranium has been fired in, and it named the places, and it said Maryland. I said, what do you mean Maryland? Aberdeen Proving Grounds, not far from where I have lived, fires depleted uranium to this day.